Hey folks, how are you? Coming here from Maryland and Conroe, Texas, or is it Conroe, Texas? Clinton, New York, Arlington, Massachusetts. I love the town of Arlington. Great bakeries in Arlington and quite good Mexican food. Hadley, Massachusetts. Logan Square, Chicago. Raleigh, North Carolina. Salem, Oregon. Wellesley, Massachusetts. And here is Sandy from Green, Maine on Facebook. So we're all good to go. Aurora, Colorado, sorry. New York, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Copenhagen, near my sister. All right. So you have a lot of questions today, but I'm going to do something different today. And that is talk a little bit about where we are as a country and where we have been over the course of this year, because it is December 30th of 2025. And the United States of America and also the world has gone through quite a lot thanks to the United States of America in the last year. And of that, I'm not going to talk about foreign affairs tonight, simply because there's not enough time. I got a half hour here. But I think it's worth doing a wrap up of what this year looks like to a historian. So why don't we start with what happened in November of 2024. And that is with the election of Donald Trump for the second time, we got a very different kind of country than I think a lot of people thought they were voting for. So one of the things that jumps out from the beginning of Trump's election is that although he won less than 50% of the vote, he insisted from the beginning that he had what he called an unprecedented and powerful mandate to change the United States of America. Now, a lot of people, when they voted for him, did not think they were voting for a change in the country, despite the fact that a lot of people, including me, had been out there trying to tell them that Project 2025 was real, that in fact Trump intended to sweep up all undocumented immigrants, not just those he called the worst of the worst, the rapists and the murderers. But people didn't hear that. A lot of people thought that they were voting for lower prices or were simply tired of the incumbent or weren't paying that much attention or liked the fact that Trump did, as I said at the time, promise everything to everybody, both lower prices and tariffs. You can't have that. Protection for IVF, but increased anti-abortion legislation and so on. He promised a lot of stuff to a lot of people that was contradictory, but what that did is it put him into power. And that's what he really cared about, was being in power. And once in power, Trump and the people around him seem to have instituted a series of policies that were designed to be anti-constitutional, if you will. They were designed to go around the US Constitution. They didn't only break laws, they acted as if laws didn't exist. And that's a very different thing. And it's a very important thing because, in a way, what they were doing was erasing the whole concept of the United States of America and its reliance on a constitution that supports a body of laws that are not religious, that are not hereditary, but that are based in the idea that individuals have a right to have a say in their government, and they will be able to elect representatives who will put together laws that will be good. And if they're not, they'll get rid of those laws. They treated all that as if it had never happened, which itself was really interesting. And I think one of the reasons people had a hard time grappling with this administration at first is because we are very accustomed to living within that set of laws and saying, oh, I don't like what you did, I'm going to sue you, here's the law. Well, what do you do if somebody just doesn't pay any attention to the law at all? And what I mean by that is, as soon as Trump was elected, and I spent a lot of the day reading through a lot of what I wrote over the course of the last year. If you don't know, I write every night what happened during that day to keep a record of America in this moment. And it's funny because you always ask me how I can stay cheerful and even keeled when I write this stuff. And the truth is, for me, understanding means I can face anything. It's when I don't understand that I'm lost and frightened. As long as I understand, I feel like I can make a plan to move forward. But reading the last year, I actually didn't do it. I read a number of months and I'm like, this is horrible. I don't know how anybody could read this. So I stopped reading it and then just did it from memory and what I thought were the most important events of the last year. But and one of the things that jumped out when I read through the beginning years or the beginning weeks of this administration after Trump got elected is totally forgotten now. But on the day after the election, after Trump had been reelected, they had a Trump family portrait taken, and Melania Trump was not in it. But you know who was? Elon Musk. Which again, now you think about the fact Musk has become persona non grata, you kind of forgot that. But I remember at the time, everybody being like, wait a minute, Musk is taking Melania Trump's place. Very odd thing. But the reason I mention that is because Elon Musk is a billionaire and he has supported Trump's election with the purchase of what was then Twitter, now X, which supported him and has become just a right-wing cesspool, but also with about $190 million of support for Trump's campaign. And it was interesting because from the beginning, it seemed as if Trump essentially was going to make Musk the person to run the administration. Trump had shown signs of both mental and physical disability, and it seemed pretty clear he wasn't really interested in governing, that he was interested in getting away from the federal cases against him and in making money again. And we know now from some of the work of people like Zach Everson at Forbes, that Trump was in fact in really dire straits for money before his second term, and it seemed pretty clear that he was going to hand stuff over to Musk. And as soon as Trump was elected in November of 2024, and by the way, I won't go at this pace through the entire year because we would still be here tomorrow morning. But I wanted to set this up because the first thing that Trump did is he posted on social media Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is Latin for a new world order. And the first thing that Trump did is he put Musk, who was not elected, in charge of what may or may not have been a legal something called the Department of Government Efficiency. And that Department of Government Efficiency, according to Musk, would go ahead and cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. But what it did was it did a number of things. First of all, it slashed through workers in the federal government. It slashed through programs like the U.S. Agency for International Development, the destruction of which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, according to researchers, because what it did is it protected people in developing countries from the spread of disease and from malnutrition, and they're simply dying now. But it didn't ever save any money. The Libertarian Cato Institute recently evaluated the work of the Department of Government Efficiency and said that while it didn't save any money, what it did do was it cut the federal government by about 9%, the employees of the federal government. So the money didn't go down, but the people went down. But the other thing that it did, there are two other major things it did. One was that staffers for the Department of Government Efficiency went into most of the federal agencies and stripped their databases of the private information of Americans in order to create a federal database that could be used for a number of things, one of which would be the rounding up of undocumented immigrants. That's a complicated story, but a very important story because, and there have been a huge number of lawsuits over it, because a lot of private information got stripped by these people who were unclear. It was really unclear who they were. They were operating for Musk, not for, and apparently to create this database, not for the American people. And they still, many of them still are in those agencies, but to whom they report remains unclear because the status of the Department of Government Efficiency was never clear, nor was who was in charge of it. And that was, as I say, part of this extra constitutional effort of the administration to make it impossible to pin down who was doing what. But that's really what, in my view, and what I'm going to argue today, what was key about the Department of Government Efficiency and the role of Elon Musk in it was that he was not elected. It was not clear the Department of Government Efficiency was anything legal, but it went through the US government and it tore apart the laws and the appropriations that the US Congress had made to manage the country for the American people. Now, central to our system has always been that the people elected representatives in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and they were the ones who had what we call the power of the purse. That is, they decided how our money was going to be spent. Both the Constitution, legal precedent, more than both, Constitution, legal precedent, and the 1974 Impoundment Control Act all said that the president has no say in that. If Congress says you're going to spend $1 million or $100 million planting apple trees, and the president is allergic to apples, there's nothing he can do about it. He's got to go ahead and plant those apple trees. Obviously, I made that up. We don't have a law about that. But the president should have no say in that. The president simply has a duty, according to the Constitution, to make sure that to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But because of the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk working together with the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, who was one of the key writers of Project 2025, the executive branch under Trump grabbed that power. They took that power away from Congress. And this, to me, was the first and major shock of this administration, that the Republicans in the Senate, I didn't expect a lot out of the Republicans in the House of Representatives for a number of reasons, but I was surprised that the Republicans in the Senate didn't say, whoa, doggies, hang on there. You may not have the power of the purse, because that's all the power they have, really. So they were setting up here this attempt to go around, not even to go around the Constitution, to pretend the Constitution didn't really exist. But it didn't stop there. Think about the fact that the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate and the White House. When you have a trifecta like that, it means that the president theoretically should be able to pass whatever he wanted, right? But Trump never tried to pass legislation that he wanted. He simply did something new, and that was to declare national emergencies. Trump, between the time he took office and I want to say mid-November, don't quote me on that, declared 9 emergencies. And the trick to emergencies is that declaring an emergency often gives the president extraordinary power. And that makes sense, right? If there is an attack, if there is a disaster, if something happens, you don't want the president to have to drag everybody into Congress and debate a law. You want the president to be able to do something very quickly. And so we have written in our laws these places where the president can do things very quickly. But rather than try and get anything through Congress, Trump just went ahead and declared emergencies that would enable him to do whatever he wanted. And you saw this really dramatically beginning in April, when Trump declared that we had an emergency. And because of that, he instituted his tariff wars, beginning with what he called Liberation Day. Remember, I think it was April 2nd. And the idea there was that he could just do whatever he wanted because he had declared an emergency. Well, the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress the right to levy tariffs. That's in the Constitution. There is an emergency act that enables the president to do things in an emergency, but there was no emergency. He simply declared that there was an emergency. And then, crucially, there is a way to challenge emergencies. The Congress has to say, hang on a second there, we want to have a vote on whether or not there's really an emergency. But between the time they do that and the time they take on a vote on it, 15 days have to elapse, 15 working days have to elapse. Well, what happened was the House of Representatives under House Speaker Mike Johnson declared that for the purposes of that law, for the rest of the congressional session, no days would pass. And I couldn't believe that that didn't get more attention, because that is bonkers. The idea that the Congress can just say, oh, days are not going to pass because we don't want our president to be challenged. Well, what's going on there is interesting, because what's going on there is that this harks back to a political theory that was popular in Nazi Germany. It was articulated by a political theorist named Carl Schmitt. And he said a number of things that I'm not going to go into now, but in terms of the power in a government, what he said was that the true power in a government flows not to whatever the Constitution says, but to those people who can exploit emergencies in order to create exceptions to the Constitution so that they could exercise power without regard to the law. And you saw this in August of this year when Trump said, I have the right to do anything I want to do. I'm the president of the United States. If I think our country is in danger, and it is in danger, in the cities in that case, I can do it. That's straight out of Schmidt. And actually, J.D. Vance is a follower of Schmidt. He once said, he described J.D. Schmidt's ideas as saying, there's no law, there's just power. And these ideas of Carl Schmitt are circulating pretty widely on the American right, including with a thinker, so-called, named Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin is one of the people who's behind the Dark Enlightenment, the attempt to destroy American democracy and replace it with dictatorships. And he's the sort of guy who would just have been, sorry about what it's called, but would pretty much have been a shit poster, except for the fact that he drew the attention of Peter Thiel, who is a billionaire tech bro, who really loves this idea that you could get rid of the federal government, which is in the mind of people like him, creating regulations and taxes that make it impossible for people like him to improve society as quickly as he feels that he would be able to do. Musk thinks this way as well, but Peter Thiel is really the one who is most closely aligned with Curtis Yarvin. So you see this in the government, in this idea of just getting rid of democracy, getting rid of our Constitution, getting rid of our laws, and working outside that. All right, so we have the tariff wars, and then you're increasingly seeing this idea that Trump's got this momentum, nobody can stop him. And I think you really see that in July. It's building up through June and into July when Congress passes what the Republicans began to call the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or Zero BBBA. Which they're trying to change the name of now for the simple reason that what the OBBBA did was it put into place the ideology that the Republican Party had articulated since at least the 1990s, but back into the 1980s, that they could create a great nation if only they got rid of regulations and taxation and got rid of the basic social safety net that we have enjoyed since 1933. And you saw this in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The primary thing it did was it extended the 2017 tax cuts from under the first Trump administration, which overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy and corporations. But it also slashed Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and they let it expire the supports for purchasing affordable health care insurance under the Affordable Care Act. They cut through a whole bunch of things that would benefit ordinary Americans in order to benefit the wealthy and corporations. Now, crucially, there were no Democratic votes for those bills. And that, I say, is one of the reasons that it's caused a lot of trouble since then, because the Republicans are trying to get the Democrats to look as if they had something to do with that act, because they passed it in July and the world has changed a lot since July. So you're also seeing in that same period, the first half of 2025, increasing attempts on the part of Trump and his cronies to line their own pockets. I mean, they basically have just done everything they can to put billions of dollars into their own pockets through leveraging tariffs, through cryptocurrency, through buying or through selling pardons, through doing everything they possibly can. So you had all this going on in that first half of the year. And a lot of people, especially in the mainstream media who were watching this, either got on board or sort of stood back in horror and seemed to go, I guess we better go along with this. But I'd like to argue today that with this attempt to destroy American democracy and to work outside of our laws and our Constitution in a way that in many ways reflected the world before the creation of the United States of America, that something else happened. Now, that something else happened really from the minute Trump took office, and that was beginning in February of 2024, before the election, a number of Democratic attorneys general had gotten together and said, listen, we might have ourselves a problem. If Trump is reelected, we don't want to be flat-footed when he comes in here, because we know he and his people are already boasting about all these executive orders and Project 2025 and all the stuff they're going to do. We better be ready. So they started meeting and dividing up what they thought would be the major policies of the Trump administration that they as a group would want to push back against. So as soon as Trump starts throwing out executive orders, now a lot of people didn't pay attention to this, but it was really important. The Democratic attorneys general in different states started to sue. Those things, those cases began to go into first the local courts, but then quickly into the federal courts, where the federal courts began to decide against the Trump administration. They started slowing things down. Now, that wasn't the case in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court overwhelmingly has sided in favor of the Trump administration, not always, but a lot. But in the lower courts, the administration starts to get caught a little bit in the legal system that it had been trying to get away from. Now, you see that really dramatically beginning in March. In March, when the administration sends more than 200 undocumented immigrants to the CCOT terrorist prison in El Salvador, after a federal judge has said, don't do it, and they do it anyway. Remember that? There was this moment where it sure feels like they think they can do anything they want, but they can't. The judge, Judge Boasberg, starts to pick at them, starts to stop them, starts to say, what's going on here? You weren't supposed to do that. Who made these decisions? And so on. And he hasn't let up. At the same time, it turned out that one of the people that they didn't deport, I guess technically they might have deported in a sense, Abrego Garcia, but these are renditions. These are not, for the most part, sending people back to the countries they came from. They're sending them to third countries. That's known as a rendition. And they are sending them there, in this case, without any kind of trial, without any kind of sentencing. They simply sent them for incarceration to a prison that was notorious for torture, which is what happened to the men that the United States, including you and me, sent to the CCOT prison. That's on us, because we elected the people who did that. One of the people that they sent was a man from Maryland, a man named Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And Abrego Garcia had been before a federal court before, where a judge had said, might have been an immigration court. Those are different. So he'd been before a judge before who had said he could not be returned to El Salvador because there was a real chance that he would lose his life there. And nonetheless, the administration sent him there. Now, they could simply have said, oopsie poopsie, our bad, we'll bring him back, because at first they admitted it was an administrative error that they sent him there. But then they doubled down on the idea they were going to leave him there. And that became really important, because the judge in charge of that case, a woman named Paula Zines, kept saying, you got to bring these guys back. You have to do this. And they kept being cutesy. I mean, if you remember reading about this, they're just that sort of, that smarmy, we don't have to do what you say thing was a hallmark of this administration. But eventually it ended up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court also said, you got to bring these guys back. That was the first really this guy, not these guys, the first really major hit for the Trump administration. Now, it still didn't do it. It ended up sort of dragging its heels and saying, no, God, they remind me of 2-year-olds. Don't they remind you that way? They finally brought him back after the Tennessee had indicted Abrego Garcia for transporting migrants, and that's just been thrown out as well as of today. But that helped to focus people on the idea that the administration didn't care what the laws were. They just didn't care. So a lot of people who were willing to look the other way when Musk was doing his thing with the idea he was combating waste, fraud, and abuse are looking at what's happening to Kilmar Abrego Garcia and being like, wait a minute here. The court said to bring him back and you won't. What are you doing? And I think that's when it really hit people what was going on in this administration. And that happened in March into April. So one of the things you saw in April is a number of protests have been going on against the Trump administration, primarily the Tesla takedowns, which were going after Musk. But on April 5th, you saw the hands-off rallies around the country. And that's going to start this snowballing effect of more and more public protests. Now, the public protests are crucially important, as are all of the protests that people have been engaging in, the economic protests, the media, the journalism, the letter writing, the calling people. But one of the things that the public protests have done is that they have reiterated who owns this government. So by April, you're starting to see a real pushback about, is this government a government of extra constitutionality, or is it still our government? Now, you're also seeing by then a number of sweeping deportation efforts from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and the U.S. Border Patrol under Greg Bovino, in which they are having these very public sweeps that, by definition, tend to get people who are living in communities who do not have criminal references out for them. Because, again, by definition, you see this all over Indigenous history, in U.S. Indigenous history. Whenever there's a fight and somebody says, "Hey, let's go out and get our Indigenous enemies," they always go for women, children, and elderly because they're easy, they're low-hanging fruit. And you're seeing the exact same thing here now. Of course, they're not going after actual gang members. Actual gang members are dangerous. They're going after the guy who runs the food stand on the corner, and the nurse and the mom dropping her kids off at school, because they're easy. They're not armed. They're vulnerable. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole for me, but the abuse of power of the powerful against the least powerful people in our society never ceases to absolutely infuriate me. Like, major rule, you punch up all you want in life. You never punch down. Okay, rabbit hole, I'll stop. But this always gets me. Like, by definition, they're going to go after the weakest members of society. And there's been some wonderful work done on that a lot of this is cosplay, because these are people who want to pretend that they could be really powerful had they been deployed to Fallujah, but they didn't dare to go to Fallujah. So instead, they're going to suburban Chicago. Okay, I'll stop. But when you're seeing this whole sweep of all the undocumented Americans, this is really starting to hit home in a lot of places where people who had thought that Trump really meant just to go after murderers and criminals, who, by the way, were already being deported, that in fact that was wrong. He's going to go after everybody, which is, after all, what he said he would do and what Stephen Miller said he would do. I don't know where everybody thought they were going to find 20 million criminals and murderers and rapists in the United States. I actually had this argument with somebody, but anyway, they went ahead and did that, and it's starting to dawn on people that this is going to tear apart families, it's going to tear apart communities, it's going to tear apart hospitals, it's going to tear apart childcare, and so on. So as this is going on, now, if you remember, we're into June, and I promise I'll speed this up. We're into June, and Trump's 79th birthday fell on the same day as the 250th anniversary of the United States Army. That was June 14th, and Trump planned a parade for the Army, right? But pretty much everybody knew he was doing it for himself. And when that happened, more people organized, and they organized an event on that day to stand against kings. That was our first articulated, not first, there were actually a number of them before him, but that was the first really big articulated No Kings Day. And that was a really big deal, for not only because of the numbers, but because of the language. No kings. We've gone from a period when we have a group of people in the administration working around the idea of a constitution and laws, which is what the United States government was all about. Now on June 14th, you have people calling it out. No kings. We are a nation of laws, a nation of people. From that, you're seeing Trump increasingly frustrated and more attempts to send federalized National Guard troops and even Marines, in the case of Los Angeles, into Democratic dominated cities. So you're going to see National Guard troops in Los Angeles, in Portland, Oregon, in Chicago, in Nashville, in places around the country. And that, while it was intended to strike fear in the hearts of the cities, it didn't do that. Rather than striking fear in the cities, what it really did was it hardened opposition to the idea of a government that could willy-nilly send in armed people to those cities. And there is also, I hope anyway, horror that we lost one of our National Guard troops and had another badly injured for this performance that Trump was putting on in Washington, D.C. Those people shouldn't have been there. They didn't want to be there, and we lost two of them. And that, that's not okay. People don't like that, especially our National Guard troops. And I will not go down the National Guard troop rabbit hole right now. But National Guard troops are a really important part of our American system for a number of reasons. So that's happening in the summer and then into the fall. It's heading into the fall. And then, if you remember, Trump disappeared for several days over Labor Day. Now, Trump had been showing a lot of weakness, both mentally and physically, really for a long time now. But he disappeared for a number of days over Labor Day. It was weird, remember? And then he appeared back again, lots of speculation about what happened. But especially since then, he has shown dramatically weakened ability to concentrate, to stay awake in meetings. He's bonkers, bottom line. That's my scientific phrase for it. If you try and write down, literally, I quote him often because I think it's important to actually get his words on paper, but I no longer try to transcribe it listening to it. I actually use a recorder that does that because there's no rhyme or reason to a lot of the sentences. So for example, if you give me a speech of virtually anybody else, you get a pretty good sense what the next word's going to be. It's not going to suddenly be orangutan. You got no sense what's going to come next out of Trump's mouth. So he's starting, you can see the increasing ill health and of course the bruising on his hands, now on both of his hands, not just on one of his hands, begins really to take off and start to get noticed, still not as much as I think it should have, in September. And then something interesting happens. You can start to feel everything slowing down. Like everything's slowing down. And there's, of course, a lot of stuff I'm not talking about here. But in October, there's an interesting moment when Curtis Yarvin, the guy who was behind this whole smash it all, break it and rebuild later, he actually writes a post in his, the place where he writes. And he says it's all going too slowly. They're not going to win. It's been stopped. In order to make the destruction of democracy happen, in order to have this extra constitutional movement, it had to be lightning fast. And in fact, he described it as a moment from Star Wars in which you take a starship, if you know your starship literature, if you take a starship that's floating dead, you can smash it into full power, but either that's going to make it go faster than the speed of light and do something phenomenal, or it's going to blow up the ship. And that's what he always said that he envisioned this moment as. But in fact, what happened was that the system of doing that jump start didn't work. The more that the administration tried to work outside the law, the more the law caught up. But more importantly, not that the law is not important, it's very important, but more importantly, the people caught up. So in October, the beginning of October, Curtis Yarvin says, it's not going fast enough. I'm thinking about leaving the United States. And then on October 18th, we have the big No Kings Day. And that No Kings Day, that second one, was at least 7 million, possibly 8 million people who were counted. That doesn't count all the sympathizers that were not counted. And that No Kings Day was a really important moment in 2025. And I would argue in American history, because that's the moment when it really became obvious from what was happening in the streets that the American people had woken up and that the momentum had shifted away from the administration and to the American people. Now, I'm not at all convinced it wasn't there before that. One of the things that I keep saying is that there's a lot of organizing going on that a lot of people don't know about, don't see, that people like me see. And I'll just shout out here the Visibility Brigade, the Card Campaign, and the and Liberal Rocks, all of which are associated with me. I retweet them and I try and help when I can. And those are, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And I could be wrong, but I don't think any of them have ever made it into the New York Times. I could be wrong. There's a lot of that going on. And that's not some of the, now I could sit here and I could list another 3 and then another 3 and then another 3. So I'm not saying it hadn't happened before, but No King's Day made it visible. You know how it made it be, how you know it made a big difference? You know what happened a few days after No King's Day? Could not have been more symbolic. Trump knocked down the White House. Trump knocked down the East Wing of the White House just after No King's Day. And it was pretty clear. He didn't have permits. He didn't have any kind of environmental statements about what might have been in that building, which you have to do before you tear anything down to see if you're spreading any kind of contaminants. He clearly had no plan for what to put up next, because we don't even have a plan yet now, 3 months later. October, December, January. 2 months later. He was clearly so angry he was going to hurt somebody. And how do you hurt the American people? You take a bulldozer to the White House. And that's when we lost the East Wing of the White House. But we're not done yet. The knocking down of the East Wing of the White House was a really big deal. And you have seen frustration from that, and continued frustration with Trump's more and more desperate attempts to say, hey, I'm important. The idea of the, what does he call it? The Arc de Triomphe, which mixes both French and English together, which he intends to place between the Lincoln Memorial and Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. I'm not holding my breath to see that one happen, because it's a bad idea on any number of levels. But you're also seeing it in the paving over of the Rose Garden, in the fact that he tried to repaint the Eisenhower office complex, the giant complex from the 1880s that is beside the White House. It's gray granite. He wanted to repaint it white, and that got stopped dead in its tracks. Because people sued ahead of time because of what had happened to the White House. And you see it in the fact that he reworked the Kennedy Center and now has renamed the Kennedy Center completely illegally. I mean, that's like you and I could go put our names on it and it would be just as legal. It is still legally the Kennedy Center. And this sort of desperate attempt to say, hey, look at me, I matter. And nowhere is that more obvious in his attempt in the White House to put his own version of White House presidencies in plaques on the walls under the portraits of other presidents. I mean, it's just so freaking childish that he did that. And it's also just so desperate. I mean, who does that? Someday I hope to have time to write about what he has done to American history, but a lot of stuff's going on. So while he is doing that, tearing down the White House, of course, the Epstein files issue is heating up again. And I'm not going to do the whole history of the Epstein files here, but remember that he was trying, and his people were trying desperately to hide the Epstein files. And Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, a Republican from Kentucky and a Democrat from California, were working to get a discharge petition to force Speaker Johnson to permit a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And they got the votes they needed in mid-November. And on November 19th, the Epstein Files Transparency Act passed the House of Representatives, and then it passed the Senate overwhelmingly. It was clear at that point that even a number of Republicans had had enough, not just because they were mad at the fact that Trump had tanked the economy and had infuriated people with the deportations and had torn down the White House and so on, but also because the issue of the raping of children was one of the things that motivated a number of MAGA voters. And for Trump to say, no, there's nothing there and we're going to hide it, was destroying their own popularity among their MAGA base. So they turned on him with that. And that was a really big deal because, in addition to the fact it required that the Epstein files be released by December 19th, 30 days, it also said the law is catching up. The law is catching up to you. And it's interesting because Trump recently referred to the release of the Epstein files as something that would embarrass people. No, 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 no. It's the sort of thing that will put people in jail. And that is it's interesting. It's almost like he's trying to say, oh, it's only going to embarrass people, because the stuff that appears anyway to be in there is not about embarrassment. The stuff that's in there is about the law and the advantage that certain privileged men and women, primarily men, but also some women, used against, again, society's most vulnerable, in this case, the sexual abuse of children. That is really the story of where we are right now, with Trump's mental health and physical health breaking down, the Epstein files hanging over everything, his declining popularity, and his desperate attempt to hang on to something, to get the deal for Putin that he seems to have promised in 2016, to get his name on something, to somehow say, yes, I matter, I remain important. And I don't want to say for a minute that he doesn't remain extraordinarily dangerous, as does the MAGA movement. But what I wanted to lay out today is that in many ways, 2025 looks to me like a replay, if you will, or maybe proof of the concept of American democracy. That is, we began in January with a group of extraordinarily powerful and wealthy people saying, we don't have to pay attention to laws. We don't have to pay attention to a constitution, which, by the way, they were taking advantages of the American people that Parliament and King George III would never have considered, bound as they were by things like the Magna Carta. So Trump was doing stuff that King George never would have tried. But that idea that they didn't have to answer to anything or to anybody is very much the mindset that gave rise to an opposition in the 1750s and the 1760s, really, and the 1770s in their colonies that said, hey, wait a minute, we do have rights. We're not revolutionaries in the sense that we want to destroy the world. We are revolutionaries in the sense that we want to go back to a system in which we enjoy the rights, in their case, of Englishmen. And that's what Americans began to say, beginning here in about March. Hey, wait a minute. We're not looking to create a revolution that goes, does something wild and crazy the way you keep screaming about. We want the rights that are guaranteed to us by our Constitution. We want the right of due process, which Kilmar Abrego Garcia never got. We want the right to have our representatives spend our money, which is what the Constitution says they're supposed to do. We want our representatives to decide our foreign trade policies, which is what the Constitution says they do. We want to make sure that troops can't come and arrest us on the streets, which is what our laws say that we have the right to be protected from. What Americans began to say in the spring and the summer of 2025 is we stand firm on our Constitution and the rule of law. And more people began to look at that. And yes, some of them come in from one direction, some of them come in from another, some of them just don't like Trump, some of them are mad that food is more expensive and that housing is out of reach. But what they're saying at the end of the day is you can't operate however you want. You must operate according to the law, and according to the will of the people. And the law began really to sink in its teeth in the middle of the year, over the course of the spring and the summer and into the fall. But what really begins to matter, at least by the summer, is that as our political leaders, and I hate to say it, many of them failed us. They were not pushing back to the degree they wanted. They were not speaking up for us. They were not stopping Trump. As that happened, the American people said, wait a minute here. This is our government. This is not, we don't want representatives who aren't going to represent us, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents or whatever. No, we need people who will stand up and defend the American people. And that's just what the leaders of the American Revolution said. We need to be represented. What we care about needs to be represented. So where does that leave us in December of 2025, where we are now? I keep saying that I think the next several months are going to be bad. They're going to be brutal. Trump and the MAGA Republicans are not going to give up power easily. They're going to be worse and worse than they ever have been. So don't think for a minute that this is going to be a cakewalk. They could still win. They could still impose a dictatorship on us. But that's not what I see. I look at where we are and I see that the momentum has shifted to we, the American people. And that takes me back actually to the framers of the Constitution and the founders who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who began to argue in the period in which they lived that it was only by seeing what a dictatorship meant that people really could appreciate the benefits of liberty. The only way you could really appreciate a democracy was recognizing what you were losing as somebody tried to take it away. So for me, I look at this moment and I see 2025, first of all, as horrific. I don't want to downplay that at all. We are all exhausted. Nobody likes where we are. Even the people who seem to be calling all the shots, they seem like miserable people. I mean, like emotionally miserable people. They never smile. They don't seem to have any friends. Rabbit hole, sorry. It has been a horrible year. But what I see is the attempt to get rid of the government under which Americans have lived for almost 250 years and replace it with a strong man who will usher in white Christian nationalism, a theocracy that will force all of us to live under a rule that is favored by only about 4% of the American people. And as that really hit home, when people like me said that in July of last year, people were like, oh, you're exaggerating. That's never going to happen. They're not going to take away our rights. Now that it is happening across the board, more and more people are waking up and seeing it, and they're pushing back. And as they push back, it will become harder and harder for our elected representatives to continue to side with the MAGA Republicans. As that support erodes, especially if it continues to erode over Epstein, you're going to see more retirements on the part of MAGA Republicans or Republicans who don't want to be in the minority in the House of Representatives. But you're also going to see the rise of new leaders in the Democratic and the Republican parties and independents, and with luck, third parties, who will articulate and embrace new policies. And that one of the reasons that people like Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland support ranked choice voting is that would be very conducive to that. But so I see this as a moment when we are reclaiming American democracy because it is under attack, and we could still lose. But if we win, here's what we need to do to make that create a better society. We must, going into 2026, articulate what we would like this country to look like. My version is not going to be your version. That's fine. The more people, us and leaders, who articulate new policies the more they will be tested, the more people will either like them or dislike them. Some of them will rise, some of them will fall. That is how we will create a new ideology to take the country into the 21st century. Now, just today on Talking Points Memo, Josh Marshall, who's a great thinker, um, said, he was looking at the numbers and he said, it's really shocking how much Americans hate AI. We hate it. And yet it's being forced down our throats by the tech bros who seem to think that it's going to make them a gazillion dollars. That's the sort of thing that needs to be on the table. What do we want about AI? I can't imagine there's not some good stuff about it, but it seems to me to need regulation. Maybe you disagree. We need to hash that out. And going into to 2026, think about what your main issues are: education, healthcare. Maybe you're really concerned about opportunity, housing. Maybe you think that there are too many regulations. Maybe you think that there are too few. Now is the time to be speaking up with people at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level to articulate what sort of values we want to have going forward. And as we do that, some of them will rise to become enormously important in 2026 and 2028 and going forward. Others will fall away and become less important. And that's going to frustrate a lot of us. I can tell you right now some of the things I want are not going forward. But that's how this system works. And one of the things about the empowerment of American people through the course of 2025 and their realization that they have agency is that it's incumbent on us then to articulate what it is we really want. So where I feel like we are now at the end of 2025 is that we have survived this year, which is no small thing, but that it has set us up to move into a reorientation of the United States of America in a new world, because what Trump has done in foreign policy has dramatically changed the rest of the world. It has made it terribly, terribly, terribly dangerous. One of the things that I think we must do is manage to make sure there is not a World War III, which Trump is setting us up to stumble into. But we must figure out how the United States of America can fit into a world going forward. And for all the fact that that's going to be so much damn work, it's also an astonishing thing to live in the moment where you get to look at the destruction of a world that, people like me did not want to see happen, right? I kept saying, this might be good for the country, but I don't want it to happen. But it did happen. We have watched one world begin to pass away. And now it's up to us to build the next one. And if you think about it that way, it's a pretty cool place to be at the end of 2025. I want to thank y'all for being here this year. It feels like we finally have a schedule down for these talks. We'll see what happens in the new year. I have no real changes planned, except that I had a huge breakthrough on my book over the weekend, I guess. Yeah, over the weekend. So I hope to finish that book over the course of this year. Otherwise, I will be here writing every night, doing these talks. Got a bunch of great interviews lined up. I talk with Joanne Freeman on Saturday mornings, and we'll just see what 2026 brings us. In any case, I couldn't be doing it all without you, and I'm just so honored to be part of your community. Thanks for being here, and best of luck to everybody in 2026.